we have Jamie Greer in the green room, but hold on. John Muse always keeps me in check. He
Oh.
he just texted me a photo of the book. So I was like, "Oh, yeah, you're a genius, John. That's why we love you." All right. So there's the book right there. It is Killers, Butchers, Crybabies, and Canadian Destroyers: The History of Pro Wrestling in Windsor. Mr. Jamie Greer. How you doing, Jamie?
Very good. How are you?
I'm doing good, man. We're really excited to have you on. JD and I are big fans of pro wrestling history. So as soon as you featured our buddy John Muse in the book, I was like,
yeah.
I texted John. I was like, well, do you think the author would want to come promote it? And he's like, I bet he would. So yeah, welcome to the Voices of Wrestling Podcasting Network, and welcome to the Mike and JD Show.
Well,
we're excited to have you, man.
Absolutely, it's a pleasure. I think it's the first podcast I've done since it got published. I did a couple.
Oh, wow.
I did a couple of little things when I was writing it, but it was a little more localized, looking for stories and stuff. But so this is exciting. So thanks for having me.
Our pleasure, man. So Jamie, tell us a little bit about your kind of journey getting involved, like getting into Canadian wrestling specifically. Was it something that you kind of grew up with, or was it something you kind of fell into later in life?
I kind of fell into it. I mean, I've been a wrestling fan since I was a kid, and I've just always loved it. And just more so in the last 10, 15 years, I've really kind of gotten interested in the history of wrestling itself. Not just in Canada, but the entire world, global history of it, and starting in sort of the Midwest area, and spiraling out everything else. So I was writing for Last Word on Pro Sports, the wrestling department, and I was doing that for about 6 years. And then during the pandemic there, I was looking for an article. I knew that we had two WWE Hall of Famers from Windsor, Killer Kowalski and Abdullah the Butcher.
Oh,
so I was thinking about writing an article about what Windsor's given to pro wrestling history, because I knew about those two. And then I had George Crybaby Cannon and his Superstars of Wrestling show. And then we had Scott D'Amore from TNA, well, now Maple Leaf Pro. So I knew we had those things. So I thought, there we go. I've got a cool little article of some stuff Windsor had. So I was researching the article and kind of got a bit more, and then realized, oh, I could do a few articles. And then I kind of realized that, well, nobody's really going to want, a 5 or 6 or 8 series articles on Windsor, Ontario. So it kind of just morphed into a book. And it just kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger because I kept finding more and more stories and more interesting things. Because for those who don't know, Windsor, Ontario in Canada, we're directly across the river from Detroit, Michigan.
Yeah.
So we're essentially the same. We're like the sister city. We're like our city is separated by our river. So
you could literally just drive like over a bridge, like through the border on into Windsor, right?
Absolutely. I live close to downtown, and I can make it across to Detroit in about 20 minutes. So it's
okay.
It's very close.
I did some good gambling in Windsor back in the day.
Oh, yeah, I bet.
So like when one of my favorite things about writing and really digging into stuff is researching. And
absolutely.
What are some of the things that really surprised you that you uncovered that you didn't see coming when you were putting this together? Like, what was something that kind of, I didn't see that happening? Like, talk a little bit about that.
There were some cool things. One of the cool things was because I've been a big fan of Chief Don Eagle, the Indigenous star. Everything I'd read up until researching the book had him starting off in Montreal, the Montreal territory. Which is perfectly reasonable because he's from the Kananakwe reservation just outside Montreal. So it's a pretty reasonable assumption that he started in Montreal because that's roughly where he lived. But what I discovered was I have him doing a 6-month stint in Windsor and Detroit for about 6 months before his Montreal debut. So I've managed to figure out that he started wrestling almost a year earlier, and it looks like he came through because his dad lived in Cleveland. So because they were Mohawk, they could travel across the border at the time.
Oh, okay.
Because their passports would let them cross the border without being stopped, because it's all part of Mohawk territory. So he was constantly going back and forth between Montreal and Cleveland, where he was the gold gloves boxer. But his dad was a wrestler too, Joseph War Eagle. He's actually the guy who brought the Indian Deathlock to wrestling.
Okay.
Which is now essentially the figure 4 leg lock.
Yeah.
So he trained him and stuff, but it looks so he got sent up to Detroit to further his training. So he did a 6-month stint here. So that was really cool to kind of see this guy starting out and getting some big marquee matches at the time. Just pushing this young kid, and how they're really pushing it. It would almost be like sort of like Cody Rhodes, like in his first week, and they're talking about his dad, like, you guys might remember War Eagle, and so it was kind of cool to sort of little snippets of history and get a bit more stories that people haven't really seen or heard. And I think one of the biggest things was discovering how much Windsor was the essentially the farms league for Detroit. So I've kind of joked that the book is almost like it's like Batman's biography, but written by Robin.
Okay.
Like, because Windsor, we're still close to Detroit. We were a separate entity, but we kind of grew up very parallel to the Detroit wrestling history. So you're going to get a lot of Detroit history intermixed with it, because for a good 20-30 years, it was a lot of the training was done over here. They would come over here, train the wrestlers, and then they would do almost like a 6-month to 2-year stint in Windsor to get their ring time. They had weekly wrestling in Windsor. So you'll see a lot of guys like the Sheik, for example, or Brute Bernard, George Cannon for a while there, but George the Animal Steel, all the way up to George the Animal Steel, would wrestle in Windsor for 6 months to a year before they kind of got, okay, now we'll put them through the territory. Now we'll put them through.
So it's like, it's kind of like the NXT to the
exactly.
Windsor was kind of like the sub territory. So did the Sheik, was he the promoter of the Windsor territory, or was he just promoting Detroit, but he was kind of like friendly relationship with the Windsor territory?
He was starting, so when they were kind of working together, it was Bert Ruby, and then Harry Light, who was the Detroit promoter that was one of the co-founders of the NWA. So he was booking it, and they trained the Sheik. The Sheik kind of in '64 when he took over big time wrestling, they were filming their shows over here in Windsor.
Oh,
so our local TV station. It was cheaper. It was cheaper to film over here, and they would, and it was just an easier. They got a bigger market at the time. The Canadian net thing was broadcasting because it was shooting down.
Oh, so
it kind of got a bit more of a.
So Detroit wrestling had like a bigger market share in Canada because they were shooting in Windsor.
Well, because they would shoot it in Windsor, but because of the way that the antennas were turned,
gotcha.
You could get it as far as in parts of Ohio and stuff. So he had quite a radius.
Let me explain to the under 30 crowd in our audience, of which there are many. So back in the day, before the internet and before cable, you had to hook up an antenna to your house that would actually get the waves from up in the sky, and that's how you were able to get your television feed. Yeah.
Depending on the size of the antenna or the angle of the antenna, you could actually catch television signals from different markets.
Absolutely. Yes. And that was one of the great things about being I mean, it's funny, it's Midwest US, but we're considered Eastern Canada. So it kind of screws me up sometimes, but we're in the Midwest, and it's like on a perfect day, some of the guys I interviewed in the book would say that in Windsor, you could almost get about 5 different promotions, in the span of 2 days, because you could pick up some of the AWA stuff from Minnesota. You could pick up, WWA from Indiana. You could pick up NWA from Mid-Atlantic, and you could pick up WWF from Buffalo. So it was kind of, you got this smorgasbord of, what wrestling do I want to watch this week?
Yeah. Which one was the predominant promotion in your area? I mean, obviously besides Big Time, but I would say it's probably AWA, right? Or was it?
It would have probably would have. Well, WWA was pretty big for a while. They actually warred for about 3-4 years in the early '70s there, when Dick the Bruiser decided to come back and reclaim Detroit, because he had been the #1 guy in Detroit from '59 to '64. And then when he left to start WWA, that's when the Sheik bought in and bought Big Time and then pushed himself. So he kind of took over. But Detroit was Dick the Bruiser's town for the first half of the 60s. So then they went to war for Detroit in the early 70s there, and that was crazy. So WWA, they definitely got a lot as well. When the Sheik took over Big Time Wrestling, he kind of forced out Bert Ruby, who had been so Bert Ruby had his own promotion, Motor City Wrestling, as well. So there was a smaller independent, probably like the TNA to the Sheik's WWE.
Right. Yeah. So they have a rich history, and it seems like to me that Windsor's kind of like probably like a hidden gem of a wrestling town, because I think when people think of Canadian wrestling, naturally we always go to Calgary, of course, and then we think of Montreal. And we think of Toronto, but then here you got this, I wouldn't say Windsor's a small town, but it's, not one of the more famous towns in Canada, but it seems like they had a pretty good territory there.
Yeah, no, exactly. And I think, my big hope from this is that it inspires a lot of other smaller towns or smaller cities to look into their history, because we were very much almost like a caboose. Like it was like we were an essential part of the Detroit's history, and have our own unique history as well. But I hope that other people look into it and kind of tell the stories of some of these smaller towns, because there's so many guys came from these towns, and you start to see a pattern or a certain characteristic. And a lot of the people from Windsor, they were fighters. I mean, Windsor's a blue collar town. I mean, we're the automotive capital of Canada, so we're essentially like a mini Detroit.
Yeah.
So we were all, very union town, a lot of factories. So everyone fights and claws for every inch they can get in this city. And you start to see, because I do profiles for every era. There's profiles in all the various wrestlers that came from this area, and you see that a lot of them had these stories of where they kind of fought and clawed their way into the history books, because they were making it one way or another. And it's very indicative of this era. And you've noticed that a lot of hardcore came out of Detroit and Windsor.
Yeah, well, I mean,
a lot
Sheik, right?
Yeah.
But even going back, like Bull Curry.
Oh yeah.
I mean, he was from Connecticut, but he did most of his training here in Detroit, and Detroit was pretty much his second wrestling home, if not his first. And but then you had another guy, Nanjo Singh, who was an East Indian wrestler who was also very violent, and him and Bull Curry had some very bloody, vicious battles. This is the 1930s.
Wow.
They were using chair shots and drawn blood, and Detroit was ostracized for having these. There's a guy, Ivan Kamakov, Russian. He was part of the Kamakov tag team in the AWA in the 50s and 60s. But in the 30s and 40s, when he first started out, he was using a coat hanger. He would the triangle part. He would bend it. He would put it around the guy's head and try and strangle him. And then if that didn't work, he would use the hook and start gouging him on the face.
Oh my gosh.
This is the 1940s. So Detroit had this heart, and then of course, so there's no doubt by the time the 50s came and the Sheik, he'd grown up on all these guys being these savage brutes, and he was like, got to keep the tradition going. And then of course, Abdullah the Butcher from Windsor, Killer Kowalski from Windsor, both in that same era. also very tough, hard as nails, bust people open. So there's something in the water in this area. The Detroit River, all of Windsor and Detroit's wrestlers came out pretty hard nosed, and so it's a pretty fun ride.
Yeah, did they do some pretty big houses in Windsor? Like, did they sell a lot of tickets there?
Our biggest venue was the Windsor Arena. That was kind of our Madison Square Gardens. I'd say on average it held about 8,000. It was bigger actually in the 1930s than it was later on, because it was repurposed to be the home for the Detroit Red Wings for the first 2 seasons. While they were building the Olympia, the Red Wings didn't have an NHL-sized arena. This is in 28, 29. So they expanded the Windsor Arena to hold about 10,000. It's since backed down to about 5,000 when it became like an OHL team. But so they got some pretty big ones then. The biggest one they got was 12,000 for Jim Londos in 1930. Back when Jim Londos was probably the pound for pound the highest drawing wrestler.
He's still the highest drawing wrestler of all time, right? I mean,
absolutely. I mean, I think so. I think when you factor everything in, that he's the number one draw for sure.
Especially adjusted for inflation. I mean,
it's
insane.
Yeah, crazy reading some of the numbers, but yeah, he got 12,000, and that's still the local record here. But I was doing the math, and so I think it was 9,700 was the capacity for the NHL games at that point. So you figure there's probably another 1,000 on the ice, another 1,000 standing room. That's probably that was a pretty packed arena.
That's awesome. And they had a really good territory there. Lasted for a long time, and then Scott D'Amore brought it back. I think when did he bring back Border City Wrestling? Was that like in the mid '90s?
Border City started in '94, and it's a very interesting passing of the baton. He took directly from George Crybaby Cannon from Superstars of Wrestling. Cannon died in '94, and Border City Wrestling started in '93. So George Cannon actually threw his last card ever about a month after Border City Wrestling started, and then George passed away from cancer on Canada Day in '94. And so he's for 30. They just had their 30th anniversary, so he was doing that. And he was working for WCW when he was a teenager. He was booking the enhancement talents.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and then we just I think it's well, actually before I bring this up, I do want to get to the chat because we have a big fan of yours in the chat tonight. Scott Edwards, aka Scott E Wrestling.
Oh yes.
Our good buddy.
Friend of the show, co-host several times. He said, love seeing Jamie on the show. Reason why I'm where I'm at. Congrats on the book, my friend. So that's
yes.
The hardest working man in podcasting, Scotty Wrestling.
He is.
And then we got I don't know if you knew this, but there is actually a king of Canada, apparently. His name is King of the North. And he says, I grew up in Brockville, Ontario. And my uncle used to tell stories about wrestling coming to the old Memorial Center.
I'm not quite sure where Brockville is. I think it's up a little more north than where I am.
Probably not where a king is from, I'm thinking. I think that his king stuff might not be true. He might not actually be the king of the North. I get the feeling that's a gimmick. I don't know. Could be wrong about that.
Could be. There's a lot of different tribes up there.
Yeah. So I think I don't know if you and Scott D'Amore planned this. I get the feeling you know each other. It's like Windsor's a huge city. I get the feeling you've met. Did you guys plan the release of this book at the same time that he's bringing back Maple Leaf Pro Wrestling? The large, I guess Tony ran it back in the day, and he purchased all the rights, and now it's going to be a Windsor promotion. Did you guys plan this out? What happened?
No.
Kismet.
I mean, there was actually a lot of crazy things that happened from when I started writing it. Like Slammiversary coming to Windsor, I had no idea that was coming. And that kind of is the end of it's sort of the bookend of the book is it Windsor coming full circle back around. So I wasn't planning either, but no. I will say that I've started research on my second book, and it's on the history of Maple Leaf wrestling. But that is because of him announcing that.
Yeah.
But this one, no, it was purely. I actually, I got kind of wind of it as the book was winding down. But so I was like, shoot, like I couldn't put anything in the book because nothing had been released yet. So,
Right.
but it was there was a smile on my face, and it was I'm kind of it helps. I mean, ultimately, it's to get the story heard, because a lot of these people that I interviewed for the book, I mean, there was a lot of legends. Like I interviewed one of Paul Butcher Vachon's last interviews, Gino Brito. Like there's a lot of guys from the 70s and 60s and 50s that I interviewed. Um, but a lot of them weren't anywhere near as big as some of these other guys. So, guys like Dynamite Johnny Gates, and, these guys who are local legends or legends in this territory, but didn't go outside, mainly because they were family men that just didn't want to go further than 4 hours away. So it was like, but getting their stories out, the amount of thanks I got from family members for telling the story of their grandpa or their mom's uncle or whoever, because these stories were just fading away in their own family. And this is a testament that they can now say, hey, this guy did something in my family. Now his story's told. So that was the most rewarding thing. And again, that's why I'm really hoping that other people kind of pick up the mantle and kind of go, yeah, I can tell a story about my town here in Kentucky, or my town in Alberta, or my town in Maine, or wherever, because I guarantee you that there's dozens of towns and cities in every single state and province that has stories very much like ours.
Yeah, JD's there in Chicago, and I think there could be a
Oh,
good Chicago book, right, JD?
Yeah, I hear you.
Chicago's got a great history. I mean,
It does.
Man.
It's a bucket list thing of mine that I got to get around to it at some point.
Yeah. I mean, at one point, the wrestling world kind of revolved around it because of the wrestling TV.
Absolutely.
Wrestling at the Marigold.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Dumont Network. Yeah,
the whole Dumont Network.
It's interesting. You talked about Windsor being a little sister city to Detroit. We in Chicago kind of had the same thing around the same time period in the 60s and 70s, because Chicago was kind of carved up between, Dick the Bruiser and Vern Gagne.
Yeah.
So like talking to my dad about pro wrestling, he always talks about, Moose Cholak and, Dick the Bruiser and Vern Gagne, but it's like, for a long time, Chicago didn't have its own identity. It was like, it is this weird little limbo. So it's interesting listening to Windsor, your stories about Windsor, and hearing how it actually was more functional working with Detroit than kind of what we had here. So that's pretty fascinating to me.
Well, Chicago was kind of, it was almost like, it's like, and I'm saying up until about the 60s. Once it started getting carved up, like you said, it did. Chicago lost a lot of its luster,
For sure.
I mean, it's still. I think it was still it always remained a wrestling city, like a but as a territory, it kind of collapsed in on itself. But man, when Fred Kohler was running it from like the 30s to the 60s, it was an empire, and it was, like I said, from the 50s to the 60s, it was probably the center with the Dumont Network. But that was the end. Chicago was always the end game of. They were almost like the mini trust, because there was New York and Philly and all these kind of whatever, and Montreal and Boston. So there were the Midwest that had their own little trust of Ohio and Michigan, and Indiana, and then they all kind of had their guys, and they would send them to Chicago. All their best would go to Chicago, kind of with the others all went to New York or went to Boston. So it was because you always read about the guys always wanted to make it to Chicago. So that was that was the end game to get on Chicago TV.
Yeah, because if you got on Chicago TV, you were national. It's funny you talked about Don Eagle before. I'd written a piece for our Patreon about how Don Eagle was the first major recipient of a screw job finish when he got hosed out of his share of the world title. So I mean, these are such fascinating stories to hear that I don't think, because we have a younger audience. Mike and I are in our 40s. A lot of our audience is like, late 20s, early 30s. So I mean, like we kind of get to wax philosophically on the history of stuff sometimes. So I love sitting and listening to you talk about, what it was like, the days of Al Haft and the Sheik and all this stuff. It's it's so cool to me.
Al Haft, the Ohio promoter, he was a big part. Yeah, I love all that stuff. And I'm trying to think what age I really got into the history. It was probably in my 30s. And it was just, because I kept hearing people talk about Nature Boy Buddy Rogers or whatever. And sometimes it was just to find out, like, initially from my memories. I mean, I actually, today's my birthday. I just turned 52 today.
Happy birthday.
Thank you.
Oh, wait a minute. Happy birthday. You should have led with that.
Yeah. Thanks for spending your birthday with us.
Yeah.
We appreciate that.
Yeah.
This is the best birthday present, getting to talk wrestling with people. My wife won't do it with me.
I get that. So does Mike. We
Hey, we do have a question from the chat. This is from Everything Pro Wrestling. He says, I have a question for Jamie. Does he know anything about some of the commissions? If they had, did they have wrestling commissions in Canada in the provinces?
All the provinces have their own athletic commissions. There's actually quite a few stories about it. And Canada was super behind the times when it came to letting women wrestle. It wasn't until the thanks, John. It wasn't until the now he's throwing me off. It wasn't until the early 70s when the Ontario Athletic Commission finally let women wrestle professionally. And it all fell under because they outlawed women taking part in combat sports. So like no martial arts, no boxing, no amateur wrestling. So wrestling had to either admit it was work, which would have allowed the women to wrestle, but by doing that, it screwed themselves. So they just played along. We're like, fuck, okay, so I get sorry. So they were like, so they just didn't have women weren't allowed to wrestle. So by the late 60s, some of the people started to try and squeeze them in, and they would do them as exhibitions of like judo exhibitions. And there just couldn't be a winner. So they would essentially fight for 6 minutes. There'd be no winner, and then they would leave, and that would be their way of getting around it because it wasn't an actual match; it was just an exhibition.
Yeah, it's like my 5-year-old soccer games.
1971. So yeah, there was all these commissions, and they were just as screwy as the ones that you read about in the U.S. and all the silliness going on.
Yeah, I do. I want to share the book cover again. Again, you can get Jamie's book. Killers, Butchers, Crybabies, and Canadian Destroyers, The History of Professional Wrestling in Windsor, Ontario, Canada. You can actually get that book on Amazon right now, right, Jamie?
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay, I will make sure to link it in the comments below. So everybody go and support that. And if you buy it, send Jamie a note to tell Mike and JD sent you. That'd be cool. Or if you're Voices of Wrestling too, so tell them that the Voices of Wrestling sent you. That would be awesome. I did want to pick your brain, and I know we've kept you here for a long time, so we'll get out of here pretty soon. It's really late where you're at. About just Maple Leaf Wrestling and Maple Leaf Pro Wrestling coming back to Windsor, being rejuvenated, revitalized, brought back by one Scott Demore, and looks like it's gonna be centrally located right there in Windsor. What does that do for your guys' wrestling scene? And what do you think about a territory like that coming back? Because I don't want to call it an indie, because it looks like it's going to be pretty well funded. They're bringing back more Ronaldo. They got some WWE stars there. They got some TNA stars that are going to be a part of it. AEW, New Japan's all going to be a part of this. It's well funded, so I don't want to call it an indie. I think it's going to be pretty well produced as well. So what do you think about a thriving territory system happening in Canada?
Well, I'm just going off what I saw in the Chris Van Vliet interview he did there this morning.
Yeah.
But it seems like it's almost going to be, I don't want to say NXT Canada, because that's not quite but he wants to use it as a platform to help Canadian wrestlers get more exposure internationally and nationally.
Yeah.
Canada is a big country, but the problem is that all of our metropolitan centers are so far apart that you can't drive towns the way you can in the U.S. Like you could drive towns, bounce all across the U.S. and make your way around. In Canada, you could bounce around for maybe a day, but then you've got 3 days of absolutely nothing. So it becomes really expensive to fly. So you're almost more or less landlocked. That's why you see what you got Western Canada, you've got Ontario and Quebec, and then you've got the Maritimes, the East Coast. It's all so separate because of the time zones and everything. So I think it's going to be a great opportunity for a lot of Canadian wrestlers to get a lot more exposure, because ever since 9/11, it's just been really tough for Canadians to get across the border to get that kind of networking.
Yeah. Yeah, well, JD and I are pretty excited about it because when we started out, it was a TNA podcast. Like this was a TNA podcast. It was called Brace for Impact, and we followed Scott D'Amore's leadership there in Impact, and so now that he's no longer with TNA, we're kind of excited to see what he's going to do with Maple Leaf Pro Wrestling. And I just happen to be a fan of the idea of bringing back territory wrestling.
Absolutely.
And it from his interview today, he kind of made it seem like it was going to be something uniquely Canadian. Maybe even get on some type of Canadian streaming service. Yeah, I think you mentioned Crave. Do something like that. And maybe run it kind of like what CMLL and AAA are doing down in Mexico, or what New Japan and Noah are doing in Japan. Like do something like that, but in Canada. I think that's really cool.
Absolutely. I just noticed you're wearing a Joe Doring shirt.
Well, that's for you, sir. I figured I figured you'd appreciate that. We have to be big Joe Doring supporters.
So. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
I love it. It just caught my eye now.
What's that?
It just caught my eye now. I was like, oh, it says Doring on his shirt.
Yeah.
Nice, I like it.
Yeah, big Joe Doring fans.
Yeah, we're big Joe Doring fans. We're big fans of pro wrestling history, so we really do want to thank you for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, coming on the podcast tonight. Everybody go and check out Jamie's book. It is, once again, I'll pull up the title. Like I said, it's my brain's too small. Killers, Butchers, Crybabies, and Canadian Destroyers: The History of Professional Wrestling in Windsor, Ontario, Canada, by Jamie Greer. Make sure everybody pick up a copy today and tell them that Mike and JD sent you, and also tell them happy birthday. And make sure you're following them on Twitter.
Yeah. Great, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Jamie. And we will be hearing from you again here pretty soon. All right, everybody. That is going to do it for JD and I tonight. Be sure to check us out. I'll be back with Brace for Impact. I'll be doing my TNA review this weekend, and I'm going to be breaking down more of Scott D'Amore's interview with Chris Van Vliet this Saturday morning on Patreon. Go to patreon.com/The Mike and JD Show. But that is going to do it for us this week. And until next time, mahalo.
Competition's starting to get thick, it's the click, so I hope you watch your A game. Amen. No rain from the track when we unite and spit. This isn't A game.